All right. Take it away, Steve, Jessica, and Dave.
Julie, can you introduce Steve to us all?
I'm
Some
sorry.
of us know who he is. Or at least everybody, because everybody
Okay.
might not.
Yeah, okay, so Steve's most important claim to fame is that he is Catherine's dad. At least that's how I know him. Primarily is and Tim's new father-in-law. So Dr. Nishibayashi has served as a pediatrician most of his career, and is also very interested in infectious diseases. And it may sound like a strange hobby to some people, but that's kind of his hobby. And he's been very interested in staying up on all things COVID, the science around COVID, around its spread, the vaccines. So he brings an expertise from his medical background that is, I have found very helpful. Jessica talks to people about genetic counseling and concerns that they have about genes. And David Frank looks at teeny tiny things through microscopes. Microbiologist. So, and I know that with Jessica serves in healthcare, and she's been aware and been made aware of things regarding COVID, maybe more than a lot of us have. And David's been reading papers and trying to stay up on things, all things COVID. So thank you, Linda. I didn't have that written down to do, so appreciate you doing that. All right, so take it away. And or maybe you know what, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna go through and ask the questions, and we'll go from there. So here's a question. What evidence backs up the FDA's conclusion that the vaccines are safe with only emergency use approval? I think of it as emergency use approval means that the vaccines are safe, and regular full approval means they are extra super duper safe. Is that fair? So if you could speak to emergency approval and the efficacy of that. Who wants to launch?
I think Steve could probably give us, from the medical perspective, could give us the best on this.
So in order to get emergency approval, there are 4 steps of study, and you have to go through those steps before submitting the clinical data to the FDA for approval. And they will only grant emergency approval if it's deemed to be safe. The designation of full approval, which may be forthcoming in the next 3 or 4 weeks with regards to the Pfizer vaccine, has to do with monitoring for even a larger clinical patient size, as well as for further emergence of side effects or things that might be causally related to a vaccine. So there are also some economic ramifications of giving full approval. But by the time they give emergency use approval, which we've now had for in excess of 6 or 7 months, large studies have to be done. And there's no vaccine that has had the large study that COVID vaccines have had, not only in this country, but internationally. In my career, people may be aware that vaccines can take anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12 years to get approval, mostly because it takes that long to A, collect enough data, and B, monitor for long-term side effects. So this is extraordinary, but we've never had such extraordinary numbers of cases, illness, and deaths, as well as vaccines to be studied in more than 100 years, if ever. So again, the emergency use approval has been granted because it was deemed to be safe, but they continue to monitor.
A follow-up to that, you said, I thought I heard you say no vaccine has had this kind of a large study?
So there's kind of two things with that. One is just the amount of scientists, medical response around the world that has been looking into this in various countries. And weirdly enough, the fact that especially last year that we had such high caseloads in a lot of places worldwide actually made the studies easier to do. Because one of the big things for showing that a vaccine is effective is you need to be able to show that, okay, the people that have taken this are getting it at a less, at a considerably lesser rate than those that don't have it. And when there's a whole bunch of people that can potentially get it, it's very easy to actually get those numbers pretty quickly. So part of the thing that actually helped this go as fast as it did is that we were as bad as it was. So.
Any follow-up, Steve or Jessica, on that?
Only in the sense that we're talking, in this country alone, we're talking about 100 million people who've been vaccinated. Studies just don't occur like that. And because of the wide prevalence of the disease, and therefore the administration of the vaccine and acceptance by some 50% of the population in the US alone, that's what allows the collection of a huge sample size.
Thank you. That's really helpful to hear articulated. Okay, does that, I'm going to ask, does that answer the question? Does anybody else have a follow-up there or something that would help them clarify? Is that clear? Is that clear for folks? All right. So the next, whoops, I hit the wrong button. The next question is about masking. All this, the changing about masking. So if I know someone, if someone I know is regularly indoors with an unvaccinated person and both are unmasked, I know it sounds like an algebra question, but it's not. And both are unmasked, should both of us mask when we're indoors together? Is wearing a mask, well, let's just start there. I've got a couple of mask questions. So if another person who is vaccinated but spending time regularly indoors with someone who isn't vaccinated, what should I do? Or what should we do when we're together indoors, the two vaccinated people?
I think you can't overdo it on the masking. One doesn't know who is and who isn't vaccinated necessarily. I wish I could be confident that people who proclaim to be one or the other, vaccinated or otherwise, could be believed. But I think in order to protect oneself and to protect other people, right now, there's no such thing as wearing too much mask.
Okay. And here's a question. Which of the vaccinated people is on which train leaving from which station? Okay, all right. That would be Aaron. Okay.
Well, one train is going at 75 miles per hour and the other is going at 120. No,
and is wearing a mask, this is a question that has come up. Am I in danger of, I don't even know if I'm saying it right, carbon dioxide poisoning if I wear a mask? You know, what's,
no,
could you talk a little bit more about that? Why is that?
Like the only real issue you really have for wearing a mask is if you're doing strenuous activity. To be mindful if you feel kind of shortness of breath or that kind of stuff. And that's just a general, you're just not potentially getting as much oxygen as you need, in which case, sit down, rest for a second. But like carbon dioxide poisoning, one, you need to get up to some pretty high concentrations for that to be a thing. And two, the mask is not going to stop carbon dioxide from getting out. Like it is, the idea of a mask is to catch small, particles of water and stuff that this virus can get a hold of or kind of latch onto. put it this way: if the virus was the size of the church, the carbon dioxide would be, the size of a head of a pin, and even that is, it's more like the difference in size is larger than that. So you're stopping the virus, you're not stopping, the other things from moving through.
So what I understand, you're saying that molecularly, the carbon dioxide is much, much smaller.
Yeah, it's like for the virus, it's like trying to fit a car through a dog door. You're not going to let anything through there, but there's going to be plenty that can come in and out. That isn't the virus.
Or a camel through the eye of a needle.
Yeah.
Okay.
And remember also, oxygen has to get in and out and carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to be similar sized models, or in size. But also think about a neurosurgeon. You wouldn't, if carbon dioxide poisoning were really an issue and you had your neurosurgeon wearing a mask for hours at a time, that doesn't fit. We have surgeons, thankfully, who wear masks, doubly thankfully, and they don't die of oxygen deprivation or carbon dioxide poisoning during your surgery.
That is a good thing.
And if I remember correctly, thinking back to an old biology class, I think we breathe out oxygen a little bit too when we exhale. It's not just pure carbon dioxide. There's several things that we're exhaling. So, there's a little bit of oxygen in there too when you've breathed out, in addition to what comes through the mask.
And depending on what you ate last night, right?
You might pass out from the odor.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
So let's shift and talk about long haul COVID. A little bit about that. Tell us, what is that and what are my chances of getting it, especially if I'm unvaccinated or vaccinated? So Steve, you want to start this one out, the long haul COVID?
Long haul COVID has to do with symptoms of a variety of organ systems that is still being studied and explored and revealed. Symptoms lasting I believe the case definition is in excess of 8 weeks from the time of actually having the acute infection. It's a small risk, and it's not exactly clear why that occurs. Does it relate to the vigor of one's immune system? That's one hypothesis. I don't think it's fully understood why, or why it affects more systems than just the respiratory system, which tends to be the system involved in short-term or acute COVID infection. It is interesting that some of the people who have had long-haul COVID have seemed to have some of their symptoms resolve once they receive the vaccine after getting over the acute infection. So I can't give you a number of the chances of getting it, but it is small, but it's substantial because of the length of time people have symptoms.
Okay. All right. Whoops, I keep pushing the wrong icon. Why is it recommended that people who've had COVID should also be vaccinated? Aren't they already immune?
There are two answers to that. One is they develop an immunity, but it's short term. And two, it's felt that the antibody response is not as vigorous as that which occurs after vaccination.
And is there some data on that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I can't give you a citation. David, did you start to say something?
Oh, I was just going to agree with you. It's just that the general data has shown up is that, especially as the new variants have come out, that the people that have gotten COVID previously are not as well protected as those that have gotten the vaccine. And my own thought process on this is that your body, when it encounters this virus, it's going to try and figure out just whatever it can in order to stop it. So it may latch onto one protein or another for antibody recognition. Whereas the vaccines, they're specifically designed to teach your body to recognize kind of the means of infection. So like how COVID is entering into your cells. So one of the benefits of specifically going after that is not only is it something that, the viruses should have and shouldn't change too much, even as they kind of mutate and change, but because it's going after the means of infection, any antibodies that bind to them are going to get in the way of the virus getting into the cell, as well as help your body to recognize the virus and kind of deal with it. So it's basically a nice kind of 2-for-1 hit with it. So I don't know the science behind like why it seems to have longer effects on antibodies than just getting infected with COVID. But the data seems to be there, and the design for the antibodies also fits in with that. So,
okay, right. Next question: what risk do I have of getting COVID if I'm pregnant?
The main concern with COVID-19 and pregnancy is that people who are pregnant have a higher chance of having a much more severe course of disease and symptoms. So what we wouldn't want during pregnancy are things like long prolonged fever, which can adversely impact pregnancy and fetal development. So pertaining to a follow-up question that I know we have of, would the vaccine be harmful to me while I'm pregnant or while I'm breastfeeding or something like that? And the answer is no, because it will help prevent infection, and any side effects that may arise from that would be less of a concern than a full-blown COVID-19 infection, and can often offer some immunity to both mom and baby, either while they're still pregnant or during breastfeeding.
Okay. Steve, do you have any follow-up with that from your
Only endorsement of Jessica's comments.
Okay. And if the vaccine becomes available to young children like under age 12, how can I know it will be safe for my child?
it's not going to become available until it's deemed safe. Like they've just recently, I think they extended it to younger children, drug trials with it. So, I mean, you can opt into those if you get the opportunity, but like similar to, like they didn't really allow widespread vaccination of children 12 and up until, when did that happen? A couple of months ago?
Longer than that.
Longer than that. But they were doing studies with that age group before they allowed for widespread vaccination. That's basically what they're doing now with the younger age group. So when it becomes available is the point at which it's going to be determined safe for that age group, basically.
Okay.
The best estimate that I've heard, and I believe is Dr. Fauci, who said he anticipated no earlier than mid-school year, but that's just speculation. Just knowing the rigor that vaccines have to be, that vaccines are subjected to, I had thought earlier this summer that it wouldn't be available for this school year. Dr. Fauci, who obviously knows more than I do and has insight that I don't have, but my conservative estimate of next school year was based on what I know about the rigor, not only from the CDC, but the FDA and the ACIP, which is a combined study group of both family physicians and pediatricians. And before it gets approved, they all have to have buy-in. There are lots of smart people with access to lots of data who rigorously examine the data before granting either emergency use authorization or ultimately full approval. So when they say it's safe for children, I'll believe them.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, both of you. And Steve, knowing all of those layers, I find helpful to know too. So this is a kind of follow-up with children. Aren't children much less susceptible to COVID? And are there precautions we can take as a family with our children going back to school?
Children tend to have milder cases. However, there is an entity that has been relatively unique, if that's not bad English. Catherine will correct me on that. Relatively unique called MISC, which is a multi-system COVID infection, which is also poorly understood. I speculate that there may be some relationship between that and long COVID having to do with the relative vigor of immune systems. But that's speculation, and it doesn't really help a child who has MISC. But they tend to have less severe cases as a general rule. The precautions that you can take is getting the adults vaccinated, practicing good hygiene, whether it's the common cold or whether it's COVID or any other infectious disease. If you're ill, avoid other people. These are things that we should practice regardless of what the infection is. The interesting thing that may or may not be known to the people in the room is that we had almost no influenza last winter because people were masked, were distanced, were more vigilant as a generalization about hand washing and contact with others, hugging, kissing, eating together, all of those sorts of things. What's really interesting is that in the late spring, summer months, we began to see emergence of something called RSV, or respiratory syncytial virus, which is predominantly a winter illness. But as people became less vigilant about masking, hand washing, interacting, came out of our own respective quarantine silos and cells, then we saw a late emergence of late in the season, and unusual for this time of year. So it speaks to the effectiveness of masking, hand washing, distancing, just being smart socially from an infectious disease standpoint. So that's how families can protect their children going back to school.
Steve, oh, go ahead, Dave.
I just want to, because you couch that starting off by talking about what else can do. So I want to make sure it's clear to everyone that masking applies to kids as well, that getting them involved and making sure that they're following, good kind of hygiene protocols is also quite important to making sure that they're protected. So
I know here at the school, at the center, the young children, their age, 2 and over, have no problem with a mask. They're growing up with it. It's not a big deal to them. And Steve, I had read, it was an op-ed about children and COVID. And I don't know if I don't know where this number comes from, but the author said that one child died of the flu this last year, but 500 have died of COVID. Is that something you know about?
I think the number of one child, well.
It says nationwide.
Right. I think that the one child dying from flu this year seems like a low estimate, because typically we have thousands of children die from influenza every year. That didn't happen this year, again, because of some of the precautions. There have been about 400 pediatric deaths from COVID in the nation. But if we didn't have COVID and we just looked at deaths from influenza, that normally runs in the thousands every year. And that's assuming that people get influenza vaccine, which has nowhere near the efficacy that COVID vaccines have. Influenza vaccines, depending upon the year, have an efficacy somewhere between 50 and 70%, maybe a little bit higher than that. The COVID vaccines are in the 90+% efficacy as far as preventing morbidity, meaning severe illness, hospitalizations, and death. Now, there's argument about who gets flu vaccine and discussion about who gets vaccine for influenza on an annual basis. But we didn't have influenza this year, whether you got vaccine or not, but it has to do, in my opinion, with masking and the social distancing and the just personal protective behaviors that isn't specific for COVID. It's for the common cold.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting that how many lives might be saved if we masked. Isn't that an interesting thing to ponder? Another question that's come up in the chat, and this is a little further down, but let's go to it right now. Do the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines change my DNA? Can you guys talk about that?
Okay, so they don't. This is something that I feel very strongly about, so I'm going to hit this. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are both RNA based, and the difference between DNA and RNA, if DNA is the cookbook of what makes you you, RNA is your body's way of making a print of a page with tissue paper and then using that print in order to do whatever recipe it needs to do. It's there for a bit, it gets used up, and it kind of just breaks down over time. And that's kind of the big thing about these vaccines is we can use the RNA, add it into your system. Your body can use that recipe to make the spike protein. And then as it's using it, as it's trying to, follow the recipe on that piece of tissue paper, it breaks down and then it's just gone. It doesn't go back into the cookbook. It doesn't affect anything else in your system apart from just making the spike protein. And even the spike protein, after it gets made, your body has systems to not just immunological, like your antibodies and all that other kind of stuff, but has a lot of ways of breaking down protein over time, especially if it's protein that is not supposed to be there. So there is no way, effectively, it is impossible for the mRNA from this vaccine to change your DNA. If it happens, you would have to have so many other things going on in your system, it would just be impossible, statistically impossible for it to happen.
And even more important than that, the mRNA doesn't get into the cell.
Oh yeah, that's
the mRNA allows entry into the cell of the spike protein to stimulate the production of antibodies, which is the desired effect. The reason that the two vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna required such specialty care, being frozen at super cool levels, is because of the fragility of the mRNA. It just doesn't survive very long. It's not long enough to do any harm. And it doesn't
hence
enter
the temperature.
anyhow. Excuse me?
I was just going to say, hence the temperature of the vaccines.
Right.
Of those types of vaccines.
Okay.
Yeah, and your DNA isn't just in the cell, it's also in the nucleus inside of the cell. There's multiple layers of separation. So no way for it to get to it.
Well, wait, no, the mRNA is going to get into the cell because it needs to be able to use the ribosomes and other structures that you have in there in order to make the protein.
But not
right?
the nucleus.
Or am I misremembering? Yeah, but not the nucleus. So yeah, Jessica's right. There's multiple, so there are multiple structural, mechanistic barriers that would just make it completely impossible for the mRNA to modify your DNA in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. Can't happen.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
All right, that's good. What's the big deal about Delta? What makes it more transmissible? Is it really more transmissible? Why? How?
My impression is that, go ahead, sorry.
The viral load, even vaccinated people have been known to have higher concentrations of Delta variant in their upper airways, meaning their nose, where they do the swabs. And so that's evidence of the transmissibility. If you sneeze and you've got 100 times more virus of the Delta variant than an Alpha variant, for instance, that makes it more possible to spread to other people.
Just because there's more of it.
There's more of it to share with others.
Sharing is not caring in this. Jessica, what were you going to say? Was that
essentially that?
Oh yeah, love Tim's comment. The vaccine won't make me an X-Men. Nope, sadly, David says.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. What about, is there anything else about the transmissibility of the Delta variant? Recently, I got a text. Someone said they'd heard from a hospital. I don't know. I haven't been able to vet this, so I don't know how true this is, but this is starting to circulate. That Delta variant is, you can get it. It's being, what's the word, spread very easily at gas stations. So be real careful, and wash your hands. And so is it more transmissible on surfaces, or is that something that's just a urban myth kind of stuff that's?
I mean, I think that's more the leftover of the fomites that we had early on in this. I don't think there's been much to really show transmissibility via surface. Like it's mostly been shown to be aerosolized virus, like just breathing in and out the virus itself. So, which is good. It means it doesn't seem to live on surfaces for long periods of time, which, that's a mode of transmittance we don't have to worry about as much, even with the Delta variant by the sounds of it.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, there's always the possibility of a new variant coming out that maybe is able to live outside the host for a little bit longer. But so far, I've not seen any evidence of that.
Mhm. And
But you
I'll
should
take
be
that
washing your
opportunity.
hands after pumping gas anyhow.
Yeah, right.
There can be other things on the pumps.
All right. Good.
And I was just going to say, I want to take that opportunity again to reemphasize the importance of masking in light of that higher viral load and mostly breathing in and out. The science is supporting that masking is even more important with this, and it was already pretty important.
Okay. So breakthrough infections, we've been reading and hearing a lot about what's called a breakthrough infection. So if some vaccinated people, I have two questions. So the first one is, if some vaccinated people are getting infected, why should I get vaccinated?
Because it won't be as bad.
Yeah.
If you do get it, it will very likely be a milder case.
I mean, you can even kind of think about it to, like, I've had years where I've forgotten to get the flu vaccine, and then I get it, and I'm just knocked out for a good couple of days.
Mhm.
And this is kind of a more extreme scenario here, right? Because the protection against morbidity and just worse infections in general for the vaccine is really, really good. Like we've got kind of a silver bullet, almost a silver bullet when it comes to preventing the absolute worst of the disease. So making use of that and making sure you're as protected as possible is definitely something you want to do.
Can I pass on COVID to others even though I'm vaccinated?
That is the concern. That's
That's
why
right.
you
Right.
that's why you mask even when you've received the vaccine. So that if you get
The latest, yeah.
infected, you don't spread it to others.
Mhm.
Jessica, you were saying too?
I was just going to say the latest I've heard is that they do think that vaccinated people who are symptomatic can pass on COVID to others. But what's less clear right now is if we have an asymptomatic carrier who's vaccinated, if that person can spread it. I think that's still a little bit unknown. Correct me if I'm wrong. But short answer, yes. And that's why the precautions are still so important.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything definitive on the asymptomatic vaccinated people either. But I mean, it's just kind of a general thing. Like if you are ever sick with something, you shouldn't probably be going out and or going into work spreading around people that could get it. You want to take that sick day or kind of keep to yourself until the symptoms abate.
Well, and if you're asymptomatic, you don't know. And it's like the data, we just don't have enough. We're still collecting data, right? As things evolve. One last question.
Julie, if I could add just one other thing to the why should I get vaccinated? In excess of 99% of the hospitalizations and deaths are in unvaccinated people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you, but that's,
No,
I think that's a
please.
critical observation. And there's no disputing that I'm aware. The hospitalizations and deaths, and if you look at Florida and Louisiana right now, those hospitalizations and deaths are occurring in the unvaccinated population.
And even more than that, the states that we see have the worst surges in Delta right now are those states that have the lowest vaccination rates. Like just, lowest vaccination rates, lack of mask mandates, actively stopping of mask mandates by some governments or by some state governments. It's very, we have a real-time scientific study showing us the effects of vaccination and mask mandates, basically.
Yeah. This is a last question. And if you have any other questions, you want to put them in the chat, please do. What would you say to someone who they intend to get vaccinated, but they feel like it was so rushed and they're just kind of waiting and seeing, I'm just not quite ready yet? What would you say to that person who's still hesitant?
I think we can go back to what Steve was saying earlier, actually. Like usually vaccines take time to put together because just the data takes longer to get. Like it's expensive to put together a new vaccine. And usually that means that there's going to be smaller studies to begin with in order to just kind of check things beforehand and do larger studies later after some effects have already been shown. They started off with some pretty big studies here because one, there was a lot of interest in it. So there was a lot of funding towards it. And two, it's a worldwide pandemic. You could go to any country on Earth and run a study and collect data. So both the amount of funding towards it and the ease at which you could collect data meant that what may take 10 years to do for another vaccine, you could do in a few months, just because there was a lot more money thrown at it and a lot more people doing the work on it. So the crazy thing is this could be how we deal with any disease if it's dealt with at a global level. It's really just a question of whether people will put the funding and effort into it.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about what we could do if this kind of cooperation happened, around other illnesses and disease. A question has come into the chat. As a pediatrician, what do you see about mental health of children from masking? Steve, can you speak to that?
I think sick children have mental health issues. And I mean physically sick children. If they get ill, if their families get ill, that's a mental health question, as well as a physical health question. I think that there are countries in the world that mask routinely, and I don't believe they have any higher incidence of mental health issues in children than the specter of that possibility that seems to be raised. And if we want them to be back in school and help their socialization and the mental healthiness that comes from socialization and interaction, and oh, by the way, learning, I think like everything else, it's a balance of the pros and cons. And I am not aware that masking in and of itself is a mental health issue. Isolation from other children, not being in classrooms, is more of a potential mental health issue than the idea of wearing a mask, unless the children have been informed or believed or trained by somebody else to think that it's a bad thing.
Yeah. The picture of children in the Times recently with their parents with signs about, freedom from masks. What happens to those children when they are required to mask when they go to school? And it's kind of a cognitive dissonance. I hadn't thought about that, Steve. You lifting that up, for them, there's a cognitive dissonance going on. with the people who are authorities in their life, their parents and the other authorities, teachers, school people. Yeah.
Can I just go back to the other
Yeah.
question about the rushedness, if you will, if that's a word, of the vaccine? Two things about it, and David pointed out the fact that it's a huge study. But the other thing is people have questioned the mRNA technology, and that had already been in existence before there even was known of COVID. And part of the reason we were able to ramp up studies with regards to the vaccines is the technology for doing mRNA vaccines existed from previous, I believe it's in excess of 10 years ago that they've been working on the technology. So the technology is not new.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they tried to use it back when there was the Ebola outbreak some years back, and it was less effective at that point. I don't know the science behind it, but like this is something that has been in the works for quite some time. This is the first time that it's been used at this scale, but it's not as new as you might think.
Okay. Well, that's
the thing I would say to that is people who want to wait and see, I don't know how large you need to make the study size and in what time frame to say, oh, now I believe that it's safe. Again, we've had over 100 million US people receive that. That's a pretty large study size. And is 101 million going to be sufficient to change somebody's mind, or will it take 200 million? There's never been a study as big as this one, and more data are going to be hard to accumulate. However, there are countries in the world that are in single-digit vaccination. And if we want to get into a philosophical conversation about the worldwide community, and part of protecting ourselves is to protect others, whether it's in our schools, whether it's in our churches, whether it's in our country, whether it's in our continent, it's also our global responsibility.
That's an important message, Steve. Thank you for lifting that up. One of the reasons I wanted to do this was to give all of us greater clarity and about some of the things that are unfolding, and to give us a greater sense of comfort, perhaps even talking about these things ourselves. I think where we are personally, I think we're at the point of, if those of us who are, we're preaching to the choir today, right? The convinced, for the most part, how do we help each other help deliver this message, right? And so I wanted to give us some more information, wanted some more clarity, so that you might have a little more confidence, maybe even a lot more confidence in talking to other people who are still feeling hesitant. And I have to say this last question is a result of, I still haven't gotten my hair cut because my hairdresser, turns out she's not vaccinated yet. And I just decided I was going to talk to her about it. And some of this information is information that I've known about. I've learned a few more things today. And I'm really concerned for her well-being. I said, I'm concerned about your well-being. I hope you'll hear me out on this. And she listened. I don't know if she's going to, if it's going to be 101 million people, Steve, like you said, but that's a good question. What is going to make you comfortable? How many people? Yeah. All right. Any last questions before we close today?
I'll ask another question. Maybe part of that question is, there haven't been enough long-term studies, because sometimes we have to have years before we find side effects. What would you say to people who are concerned that we've only had the vaccine for a certain number of months? It hasn't been years, and maybe they're worried about that.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Tim. Steve or David, Jessica?
My response to that is 600,000 people plus have died in this country. And how many more deaths do we have to balance, to do the pros and cons of whether it's vaccine safety? But that's huge. We've never had anything like that in our lifetimes. And so I think that at this point, the impact, and I'm not even counting the families that have been affected. We're just talking about 600,000+ deaths in this country alone. If we continue to wait, how many more people have to die?
I read a columnist, his name's Gustavo Arellano, and is there a question on your end, Mike? Yeah.
Yes, I'm unmuting us. There were some questions.
Okay.
Okay. Is it possible that the virus could continue to mutate to the point where the vaccinations are no longer effective?
Is there at some point the virus will mutate and the vaccine will no longer be effective? That's what I thought I heard. Is that correct, Tom?
Yes.
Okay.
That could happen. And the best way to prevent it is to get as many people vaccinated as possible. That's my short answer to that question. Anything to add?
I think we could go, there's a long answer to the question, which would take about 30 minutes to delve into. But like it's always a possibility with these things. So far, we have seen that with the new variants, the vaccine still maintains pretty similar levels of protection. The nice thing about the mRNA technique is that if we do need to modify to kind of base it off of a newer spike protein variant, we can do that, and we can do it pretty quickly. But still, like, we would prefer to make sure that everyone's vaccinated to a point where the likelihood of it being able to continue to mutate and all that stuff is not really as much of an issue. And this is kind of this will be a very, very kind of broad thing, but the concern really is not as much as it is we want to get people vaccinated in the United States. Global vaccination efforts are going to be really key to ensuring that no new variants pop up, because as bad as it currently is here, there could be an opportunity for new variants to come out of Florida or Texas or whatever due to the number of cases. But the Delta variant came out of India because they had no real vaccination levels. Like, there was no vaccination within the country, and it was able to really replicate a lot of times. So while immediately I think there should be a focus just within our communities of trying to get people within the United States vaccinated as quickly as possible, the long-term goal is world vaccination, and any efforts that can help towards that won't just protect people elsewhere, it will also protect us here.
Okay. Anything to add,
We're
Steve?
familiar with the fact that viruses mutate. That happens every year with regards to influenza, which is why the influenza vaccine changes from year to year, and you have to get repeated doses. If we had been more successful in reducing the transmission and the replication of the virus within these millions of people worldwide, the risk of mutation decreases. Every time a virus replicates, there's a possibility that something might go screwy in the replication. We call that a mutant or a variant. If we reduce infection and replication of the virus, mutations and variations and variants will decrease, and the risk of coming up with a a variant that is worse than the Delta, further down the Greek alphabet, is greater.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another argument for getting people vaccinated everywhere to reduce the risk of mutations developing.
Thank you. Another question in the entryway, Mike, whoever you are. Or is that it?
It's like Christy might.
I don't know, because we have the
Isabel.
Caroline going, what did you have first?
I just wanted to know how the HIPAA law plays into this, because I know somebody who has COVID, doesn't give a hoot about anybody, goes out in public with the COVID and believes that it's not their business to know they have COVID. At what point do we have the right to know about that to protect ourselves and everyone around us?
That's an easy answer.
Does HIPAA still fall into that, where people have the rights where they don't have to tell anybody?
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the question. HIPAA has only to do with physicians and hospitals releasing personal information. You have the right to ask anybody that you want. They have the right not to answer you.
Yep.
But HIPAA only pertains to medical professionals releasing information, and they have to have a patient's permission what to reveal and to whom. Has no bearing on you asking your friends before they come to your house for dinner, you vaccinated?
Which is why we ask at church. You know, we are not limited by HIPAA. We are able to ask. That's a good question, because that does get misunderstood quite a bit. HIPAA does. Anyone?
And employers have the right to ask that. And it's becoming increasingly clear in the legal world that people can be excluded from certain behaviors or activities or employment if they don't conform. Each day it seems like there's a large corporation that is going to require vaccination for return to the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, any other questions in the entryway or from the entryway? No? Okay. If you didn't see in the chat, Aaron wrote, as a hospital chaplain, I can personally attest to the emotional, mental, and physical toll that COVID takes on patients, families, and caregivers. It's no joke. I learned yesterday that Pomona Valley Hospital is down 200 people, employees, and it's in large part because of just people are exhausted and they're not, you know, they're doing other things. They left that field. So yeah, it's very, this touches every part of our life. I was going to say, as a way of closing, that Gustavo Arellano writes for the LA Times, and his wife owns a shop, a grocery store and little place where people can get something to eat in Santa Ana. And she has never taken away the mask. She's always had the mask mandate, and she has gotten a lot of flack for it. But when people walk, for the most part, her customers are appreciative. She wants to protect her staff. And when someone gets a little huffy about it, she says, well, I don't know about you, but this is my first pandemic. And it's sort of befuddles me, that's my word today, befuddle, that people are so absolutely certain that it's not a big deal, or as if we've done this all before. This is all new. We're all learning as we go, and having some patience and understanding for those who are leading us through this is so important, and the people who are taking care of those who are sick. So I want to thank you all for showing up for yourselves and for your community, for our church. And I hope this gives you a little more confidence, maybe a lot more confidence, that when you have an opportunity to talk with someone who's hesitant, that you've got some more solid information and way to talk about it.
Julie, can I say something?
Yeah, Carol.
I want to thank all of you for your involvement in bringing all this information and these questions to us, because I found it even more informative than our first session, especially as we've gone along and discovered new things.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And Dawn's clapping. Thank you, Dawn. I want to give a big shout out to David, Jessica, and Steve for helping us today and being willing to be our guides and help us stay more informed. And especially Steve, because he's from another tradition even. I mean, he's, oh, shock. But we're all part of the same body of Christ. And I think we're all trying in our own ways where we are to be a healing presence in this broken world. So I'm going to close with prayer. Let's pray together. Thank you, God, for people who are learning and helping us learn, who are guiding us and helping us have more confidence to speak with courage and love for the care of other people. Bless us this day, that we may continue to carry the love of Christ wherever we go, the healing presence of God. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Lovely to be with you all, and I wish you a lovely day. Bye-bye.